All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session of this spring's Education Policy Colloquium series, sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer. I'm an academic visitor here at Kennedy School, and I'm former Massachusetts Secretary of Education. And it's a privilege to serve alongside the directors of PEPG, Professors Paul Peterson and Marty West. I don't think either of them are here. I know they're not here in this room. I'm not sure if anyone's online, but I will soldier on without them. In addition to today's event, there are 6 more sessions that are scheduled through the rest of the spring semester. Some of the topics that we'll be discussing with scholars and practitioners from around the country include chronic absenteeism, approaches to analyzing student test data, the effectiveness of preschool, teacher diversity, the sort of state of education and student achievement post-COVID, a bunch of things that hopefully are going to be interest to you all, certainly to me. And a full listing is on the PEPG website, so check it out. Our next session is next Thursday, March 7th, and it's featuring Beth Schuler of the University of Virginia, who got her PhD here at Harvard not too long ago. And Beth will be presenting her research on high-dosage tutoring in a presentation that's entitled Towards Effective and Sustainable Tutoring at Scale in the Post-COVID Era. So hopefully you'll be able to join us next Thursday, as well as all the other sessions. Today's session is focused on charter schools, and in particular, the impressive track record of urban charter schools, but some troubling recent trends that threaten that success. Our speaker is someone who knows the topic intimately, not just as a researcher and writer, but as a practitioner and as an education entrepreneur. Stephen Wilson is a senior fellow at the Center for Reinventing Public Education. He's co-founder and CEO of the National Summer School Initiative, which he launched during COVID to provide rigorous and engaging curriculum and program models to make up for lost learning time during the pandemic, a challenge which continues and I assume will continue well beyond any recovery period that we might expect. In that context, last summer, NSSI worked with 15 states, about 3,000 educators, providing training and other sort of ongoing support and serving 48,000 students. So a really impressive scale up from over a 2-year period, less even. Prior to starting NSSI, Stephen founded 2 charter school networks, one for-profit, Advantage Schools, and one nonprofit, Ascend Charter Schools. Among other things, Stephen also served as a senior advisor to Governor Bill Weld here in Massachusetts, and was co-director of Pioneer Institute, a state policy think tank based here in Boston, which is where I met Stephen over 30 years ago. And in fact, it was through that meeting, which originally was brokered by Charlie Baker, another former governor of Massachusetts, that I got started on my own education policy journey. So I have Stephen to thank for everything that's happened since, both good and bad. After Stephen's comment, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. I'll give priority to the folks who are in the room, but hopefully we have some folks online who may want to get engaged, and I will try to incorporate any questions they may have. So please put those into the chat as they come up. The session is being recorded, so in effect, we're all on the record, so keep that in mind. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the program over to Stephen Wilson.
Jim, thank you so much, and it's so great to see you again. We never actually do that very often, so it's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. And Jim, you left out all of my failures, and there are many. So look, I would like to tell a story today. I think it's a really interesting story about what I think is the greatest success in school reform of the last century, how that reform was won, how it was lost, and how we could bring it back. So we have to go all the way back to the condition of schools at the time that the charter movement began. I'm going to truncate this history so that we can really settle in on what's happening now and recent developments. But I think the context is extremely important. So there was a time in the early 90s, which, as Jim said, wasn't that hard to believe, when reformers were frustrated with trying to fix schools from within the existing institutions, the majority systems, especially large district school systems, which were essentially poverty recreation machines at the time, and one could argue still are today. And within the existing constraints of collective bargaining laws, 300-page contracts for teachers, custodians, for everything else, and all the other administrative thicket of rules, it was very hard to actually make change. So the decision was made, let's try to do this from the outside, of course, with charter schools. And it represented a very simple idea, a new bargain. And this is fundamental, that in exchange for giving us as founders more autonomy and more authority, we would be willing to be held accountable for the first time for results. And that is a really brilliant idea. And so from that, things got underway. Some of you may not know that Al Shanker, probably the most brilliant union leader of our age, was a big charter supporter. He'd come back from, in 1989, I believe it was, from the meeting of the AFT in California. He penned a weekly paid op-ed in the New York Times that was alongside the regular editorial page. And he called for charter schools. And he conceded that 80% of kids were not learning in urban schools, including his own, which was the New York City system. And he called for this wholesale reinvention led by enterprising educators. Okay, so that's the idea. And within years, all kinds of states had adopted charter laws, of course. But for the first 10 years, nothing really happened. The schools were not good. So we had all these studies, and we were all looking at these studies, hoping to see that this new bargain by itself would induce improvements. You think it would, right? If you had those new privileges as school leaders, you ought to be able to get results just from those alone. You could hire your own faculty of your own choice, which you couldn't do in school systems. You could choose your own budget. You could choose your own curriculum. But no, it didn't happen. Why? Because most founders chased trendy ideas that they heard about in schools of education that pushed all the shibboleths of progressive ed, and they didn't work. They were not rigorous academic programs. But then finally, by the way, Shanker said it could take a good 10 years. It could take a long time before an effective model emerges. I love that little bit of his column. And indeed it did. But then finally, a new model emerged. Kip epitomized it. And it had several elements. But it was based on the idea of the term. It was not their own term, no excuses. It was applied to them, and it's gravely misunderstood. Because when you hear the term no excuses, you think we're going to wail on kids, right, for every infraction. That's not what it meant, and that's what it never meant. It meant instead that we as adults are stopped going to make excuses for why the students for which we are responsible are not learning. It's going to stop now. We're not going to permit it. Within the culture of our own buildings, it's going to be verboten. We're not going to invoke the poverty around us. We're not going to invoke the problems of our families. We're not going to invoke low expenditures available to us. Because in fact, we're going to say, within these four walls, we have everything we need to succeed. That was a powerful and ennobling idea for everyone involved in those projects. By the way, it was thrilling. And KIPP got underway first with a one-year single classroom that Dave Levin and Michael Feinberg led. And by the end of it, they had striking results, and it went on from there. Of course, KIPP became enormous, the largest charter school network or charter management organization in the country, still today. And then you had many others that followed in the same spirit. You had Achievement First, you had Uncommon Schools, you had the high-flying Boston charters, you had Success Academy, and so on and so forth. And the results were really striking. I'll just name one example, less known than the usual ones we always trot out at this point. Classical charter schools in New York City, 4 schools, so fairly small, just starting in a way. 98% of students proficient in math, 90% English. Much more important, of those two groups, of those two results, more than half scored at the highest level of proficiency, what New York State calls a level 4. A really stunning result. So, and then on the larger scale, we have this recent study that you guys may be familiar with from Stanford, from Credo, which is the biggest longtime analyst of charter results, which found that we now have a lot of momentum. We have about 1,000 schools that are reversing the achievement gap in either English or math or both. We have the recent Mathematica study, which is fabulous, that looks at KIPP and says that if you went to a KIPP middle school and you followed up by attending a KIPP high school, you would not only enroll in four-year institutions at the same rate as white students, as the students of color, but you would complete college at the same rate. So that's an astonishing result. So that's why I say, among other reasons, that this is the most striking reform. Brookings Institution in their study of charter schools said, we have never seen effect sizes like this before in education, flatly. So then something started to change. Around 2008 was a period of triumphalism in the charter sector, which really wasn't very attractive. You had the movie Waiting for Superman, if you remember that celebrated the effects of these kinds of networks. But all the while, something was beginning to happen on campus. So it was a period where if you take the different intellectual trends, you could trace it to postmodernism, to critical theory, critical race theory, and so on, we began to have a set of ideas that were being introduced, which advanced a very different idea, ultimately in the form of the doctrine of anti-racism, which was fundamentally different. It said that racism is the cause of all disparities, and the overwhelming charge is to address racism. We must vanquish racism to make progress in education, a perfectly reasonable conjecture. And so this became the new marching order and the new ideology that excited people. And as one person said, it was a period of uncompromising action. To be woke, to use that term, which was not meant pejoratively, as one writer says, was to exist in a state of hypervigilance about social and political issues affecting marginalized groups. And so college students were and are passionate and idealistic and demanding urgent change. And I like this quote from Wendy Brown, a professor of social science at Princeton, that put it this way: young left activists' outrage about a burning planet and grotesque inequality and murderous racial violence and gendered abuses of power is accompanied by disgust with the systems and the rules of engagement that have brought us here. Student activists, she said, are pulling the emergency brake because it feels as if there's no time for debate and compromise and incrementalism, because many see conventional norms and practices as having brought us to the brink and kept us stupid and inert. So that is a very strong conception, and of course, a very powerful idea. But with it came a growing illiberalism. There was a loss of faith in the liberal idea, the idea of liberal education, where liberal education would afford an encounter with diverse and at times uncomfortable ideas, and we would wrestle joyfully with those ideas. We would put our own ideas to the test. We would try to repeat and express the ideas of our opponents, which is the strongest way to gain understanding not only of those ideas, but to test your own. And that began to lose its hold on campus. And we saw the birth of as I said, a new kind of illiberalism, the idea that the world was divided into the oppressors and the oppressed that existed in a kind of zero sum of power, where for one to gain power, another must lose it, must relinquish it. And it went further than that. There were also knowledge dimensions, questions of epistemology. No longer could we necessarily agree on the idea of even objective truth, right? There's standpoint theory that said that your perception of truth is a function of your class, your standing in that dichotomy of the oppressed and the oppressor. There is my truth and there's your truth. And they're two disparate views of the world. There was a turning away from Enlightenment principles. of reason, of rationalism. And so it's a really fundamental change. I would submit a rather bleak and dystopian view of the world. Speech began, and this is another dimension, to be likened to violence, right? To hear ideas that you disagree with are not only offensive, but it is traumatizing to you. To hear them expressed again is re-traumatizing, and hence the growth of the call for safe spaces where we could be assured of not being exposed to those ideas. Hence the arrival on campus of a literal army of people who would wrestle with claims and concerns by students about what their professor said, what other students might have said. And you then enter into a world where you have this sense of ideas, as I said, of violence, and you start to punish those with whom you disagree by ostracizing them and ultimately by canceling them, deplatforming them on campus, and trying to erode their ability to speak, frankly, and to be heard. And so that is a culture that we might think only applied to elite liberal institutions, but it's not true. If you look at community colleges across the country, by now they've adopted very similar stances and belief systems. So it's really quite pervasive. Well, what does this have to do with charter schools? Well, when those recent graduates who were aspiring teachers started to join these established networks, it introduced a fundamental new disruption because their convictions were really quite at odds with where they were arriving. In the charter school systems that we were talking about, the focus was very squarely on academic learning and academic outcomes. It was constantly being measured, maybe to a fault. It was about achievement. The idea was, of course, that if you had an education, you had power, hence Kip's slogan, since disavowed, knowledge is power. And so that was the driving idea. And so they were very focused on what we call the 101% solutions. Making good schools was not about a silver bullet. There was no one thing that would make it a great school with great results. We had to attend to everything from arrival procedures, how students get to class and how they're warmly greeted in the morning, to how lessons are written and tested and revised, to how the culture and discipline systems work, how assessment is used, how teachers plan together. Vastly more time set aside for professional development of teachers in these networks. Typically, all of August was devoted to training and retraining teachers versus in an urban system, you'd be lucky to get 2 days of training before the school year launched. So it's a very different kind of system. But when the newcomers arrived, the focus was quite different. It was instead of thinking, it is not that students haven't been educated, it's that students had arrived to school traumatized by the fact that their upbringing, by simply the fact of existing as marginalized people in America. And so the first task was to address students' trauma and indeed to address the trauma of the educators. So the first thing that had to happen was that the teachers and staff had to come together and to examine the institutional wrongs that had happened in the network, and they were things to look at. The patterns of disparities in promotion by race within the organizations. There was a long and not good history of deans of students being primarily teachers of color, and deans of instruction being much more likely to be white people. So that was clearly wrong and intolerable. That had to be addressed, and much more. They were looking for racial bias within curriculum, and the typical go-to, and most of all, of course, concerns about the discipline system, which I'll come to in a moment. So what happened was that these networks, seeing this, these concerns and demands from young faculty, hired diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants to come in and to lead this effort. And the DEI consultants tapped a familiar menu of anti-bias or implicit bias training, audits of curriculum and materials, hiring audits, affinity groups, this kind of thing, often without any evidence that these were effective in meeting stated goals, if the goals were stated at all. So that is what began to happen. This had a very dramatic effect on what happened in the classroom, because attention was now diverted almost completely from the quality of instruction. No longer were schools obsessing about what is happening in the classroom. What was happening before was that you were being observed as a young teacher, you were being helped, you were being pushed, and there was a spirit of urgency, right? So the urgency idea was that a child is only in third grade once. We can't screw it up. If by November, that teacher is not performing and those kids are not learning, we have to act. We have to find somebody else to put into that classroom if that teacher has not responded to coaching and development, because we can't screw up the education of that child for the rest of the year. Discipline was incredibly important. You know, I'm going to pass around a picture because despite my love of writing, there are those times when a picture is more powerful than 1,000 words. So pass this around, will you? This is a photograph from 1989, when a New York City journalist, a newspaper reporter, went to work teaching in a middle school in New York City for 1 year. And she wrote a book about it with the rather strange title, "Shut Up and Let the Lady Teach," which maybe tells you a lot, but I think the picture tells you more. So it's the big picture on the front side. It's a picture that I think really shocks. You see a classroom covered in graffiti. You see broken chairs. You see balls bouncing around. Now, maybe not in the picture, but this is what was happening. Radios playing, people in conversation. It was pre-cell phone, so that wasn't happening, but we're there, so that's what you would have seen. So complete chaos, floors strewn with trash, indifferent principal, checked out teachers, virtually no curriculum, hairbrushes and makeup, card games underway. Fuck off, the student said to the teacher and spat on her face. She turned around to face the classroom and was hit by a rock. That was not unusual. So the first step of addressing the situation in charters was to establish order. Parents were scared that their students were not safe in schools. And so they wanted safety overwhelmingly. And the theory of action was in No Excuses Schools, that we are going to attend to the small stuff. We're going to sweat the small stuff so we don't have to sweat the big things, right? So if you see this on the floor, or this, right? What does that tell you? If it stays there.
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Doesn't matter. We don't care about these kids. We have no expectations. But what if the moment I see it as a teacher, I come around and grab it? Because I'm not going to let this room deteriorate. I'm not going to send that signal, because we are better than that. We have higher aims. We are going places in this room. That was the animating idea. Well, all that fell apart because to do that was veering with controlling Black and brown bodies, right? It was to devise what is called carceral education by the detractors of No Excuses. And so all of a sudden, all that stopped. Well, guess what happened? Classrooms became a lot like, not as bad, but they started to deteriorate very quickly because they couldn't refer students out, they couldn't suspend for fear that this would be called racist. And you started to have a purity spiral within these institutions where teachers try to outflank each other for being as anti-racist as possible. So to be as anti-racist as possible was constantly to claim that you were doing more to be anti-racist than the other person, lest you be attacked as being a racist and possibly you lose your job and lose your career. So that's the purity spiral that started. You started to have a culture internally of rancor where colleagues, teachers, and educators had worked side by side for 20 years, were calling each other white supremacists, denouncing each other in an effort to kind of stay afloat in this purity spiral. And what did happen in turn from there? Academic results tanked. So the Boston charters, just to use an example, were the poster child of school reform. They had the highest results in the country in the charter sector. Wonderful, wonderful places that created real opportunity, a reliable path to college for kids. And now their results are beginning to look a lot like the system that they set out to replace, the Boston Public Schools. In New York, and I'm going to leave out network names, but one of the highest flying networks in the country that had astonishing results, is now performing in some cases below that of the school systems that they're a part of. So that's what happened. I told you it was going to be a sad story, right? But it's not over. We can get out of this. And we can rebuild. And so what I would say is that what we have to do, and this is just my own view, is that we have to restore the commitment to a liberal education. And I just want to mention that going back to, and by the way, there were other reasons why the activities of No Excuses Schools were in conflict with anti-racist. I wouldn't be very careful, anti-racist with a capital A and a capital R. You know, I would contend that the charter schools in all of their forms were among the most anti-racist institutions around, and certainly incredibly powerful engines of diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of their results. But there were other problems. You know, testing was held to be racist. Even the concept of knowledge was not uncontroversial because they're different forms of knowledge. And maybe we were just teaching white knowledge. So for all of those reasons, another thing that happened, which is very important, was that there was a very strong focus on writing and replacing existing curricula with culturally responsive curricula, which is a good idea on its face. But what happened is that, for example, in math, new curricula would be written where every math problem contained the social justice message. So it was set in some kind of social justice context. And the curriculum writers became much more concerned about the story, the anti-racist message, the context of the problem, than about the accuracy of the math teaching that was in that lesson. So in this particular net that I'm thinking of, a math curriculum that had powered their incredible success in math was replaced by a trial curriculum that was deemed to be, although it had worse results in its pilot, was deemed to be more anti-racist. And so the whole network replaced it with the new and less effective curriculum because it was sought to better comply with the ideological concerns of the network. So I think we need to return to the idea of a liberal education. And I think back to a century ago, when the president of this university in 1892 chaired a commission of leading educators called the Committee of 10, included the U.S. Commissioner of Education at the time, the headmaster of girls Latin in Boston, et cetera. And he said, we Americans habitually underestimate the capacity of pupils at almost every stage of education. And I think that's exactly right. We continue to present below grade tasks to most kids. We have very low expectations of what they're able to do. And we need to return to a liberal education people think liberal education is old-fashioned, right? It's classical. It's not the case at all. A liberal education can have a completely contemporary canon that is made up even principally of contemporary writings by authors of color. But the notion of a liberal education, rigorous, enlightened, engaged in debate, having enough respect for you to want to expose you to diverse points of view so that you can decide for yourself what to do, instead of trying to engage in a kind of conscription of students as child soldiers into an ideological cause. Let's just educate them. That is what I think we need to do. A knowledge-rich curriculum driven by student curiosity could take us to a whole new place and restore the power of this reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'll kick it off with a question, and then we'll open it up for everyone else. Stephen, why don't you sit up
Oh,
front, just so you can be seen by everyone. So maybe just picking up on your last point. It sort of begs the question about how do you envision sort of making this really in some ways cultural shift back to, perhaps maybe that's an unfair word, but towards a liberal education as opposed to one that's more, for lack of a better word, social justice oriented.
right.
What's the sort of mechanism or the first steps that we might take to move in that direction?
Well, I think we have an opening, because I think that there is a growing frustration. There is a feeling that what has been happening in the last 4 years is not helping children. That after the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning, we could have gone in one direction. We could have said, we must engage the failure of urban schools. We must ensure that all children have above grade or at grade teaching, a rich curriculum. We can no longer tolerate that we are depriving Black and brown children of an effective education. But that's not what happened. We went in a different direction. So I think there's as I said, I think that there is an incipient awareness. It's becoming possible to raise concerns. Well, we'll see if I survive today's talk, but, along these lines, and that there is a new hunger for a return to an academically rich education that preserves the dignity of every child. I mean, to say that personal responsibility is a racist concept, I think, is an essentially to deprive children of their dignity, to be deeply disrespectful. I think there's a growing recognition of that. So as to how exactly we get there, I think we need to have strong new voices, a new generation of people who call for this. And I think that there's a real possibility that will catch fire. I mean, one hopeful indication is the science of reading, the rapid adoption of the so-called science of reading in districts and charters around the country has happened really at the speed of light, getting rid of balanced literacy and other ineffective non-phonics-based approaches and putting in place that is a very hopeful sign. So maybe next we will put in place knowledge building. You know, we will displace this horrible practice of teaching students algorithms for understanding text and searching endlessly for the main idea, and instead say, you can't find the main idea. Reading comprehension, I'm channeling my E.D. Hirsch here, is not a skill. It arises from the accretion of knowledge, domain knowledge, from which you're able to make sense of increasingly sophisticated text. Well, Hirsch has been ignored for 2 or 3 decades on this front. That's about to change. I'm pretty sure of that. That would be a game changer. So if we had a knowledge-rich curriculum and we have science of reading, we're already well along the way. But I think what we have to do is we have to see that we have had a century and a half of a really ugly procession of anti-intellectual reforms in this country. We can start with intelligence testing back in 1910-ish, which was a sorting mechanism by which most students would be denied an academic education. They would be called the dullards, to use the language of the day, and shunted off to something else. Then we had the so-called life adjustment movement in the 1930s to the 1950s, where students were judged, again, not to be worthy of an academic education, and they were told how to make themselves attractive for dating or how to set up their bedroom. I mean, quite literally. And then we had the shopping mall high school in the 70s that I went to, where students would sort themselves by taking low-quality elective classes. That made it easy for the institutions because they didn't have to do the sorting anymore. The kids would do it for themselves. And a small minority, again, took academic classes. And I would put this recent reforms, this is controversial, as just the latest instance of anti-intellectualism in schools. America has got to, once and for all, abandon the pervasive anti-intellectualism that has marked K-12 really almost from the beginning. And that, I think, is our charge.
Let's open it up. Anybody have any questions?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. So I'm struggling because there's been so many claims made, right, about the stark black and white differences between what you're perceiving as training an army of soldiers into an ideology
Mhm.
versus this picture of effective teaching that was happening at charters in the 2010s. Do you believe there's room for a lowercase AR anti-racist, or even capital AR, whatever that difference meant to you? I feel like that means the stereotype characterization, caricature period in the anti-racist was meant by the capital. But do you believe there's room for effective instruction within a charter school that still is sensitive to the very consistent makeup of often largely white teachers and largely students of color? Like, is there a space where both of those truths can coexist? And then kind of a follow-up from that would be the practices that caused a lot of attention to the methodology of charter schools around when Waiting for Superman came out and all of those things were exclusion by disciplinary, right, and control disciplinary practices, which I didn't hear referenced in terms of why practices might have needed a reevaluation. And then actually college success and ability
Can you
to
pass my pencil?
thrive without the extensive control. I do not believe research-wise was consistent that students actually developed skills, but rather they were existing within a heavily mandated.
Mhm.
I know that was a lot. Sorry, my thoughts are forming out.
No, it's great. It's fabulous, and I love all the questions within. I'm not going to remember all of them, so let's go back. No, but what you're raising is incredibly important. So first of all, I believe that there absolutely is room for schools that are anti-racist, but not, I would hope, in the Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi kind of sense. But they are alternative models of diversity, equity, inclusion programs that I write about in my book that's coming out, that approach it in a different way, but with the same goals of fostering inclusion and diversity. My submission to you is that the current path will leave students more excluded, less educated, and less empowered. So we agree on the goals, but we disagree perhaps on how to get there. In terms of exclusionary discipline, actually, if you look at, there's a recent study that looks at the use of suspensions, which is the most important form or most common form of exclusionary discipline. And yes, if you look at charters overall, they avail themselves of suspensions more than traditional public schools. But if you look at urban charter schools versus conventional district schools, there's no difference.
But that data doesn't include counseling a student out of the charter.
Well, even on the counseling out, I think that what we would find if we look at the data closely is that that's not actually the case. I'm not going to be able to summon the research study, but that is a widely held contention. Jim probably knows much more about this than I do, so maybe he can save the day here. But my sense is that that's not actually true. Now, it is, there are instances where large and one well-known network in particular has done that. I'm going to grant you that. And it's horrifying, and it should never have been allowed to continue. I know this just from anecdotal evidence. It's like the child who has the special needs or has behavioral issues is isolated, and a co-teacher says, well, I'll sit with him at the front of the room and be with him, and is told, no, we don't do that. I mean, it's very subtle form sometimes. This has absolutely happened. But most people who started these networks would find that absolutely abhorrent. And part of their satisfaction and self-esteem in running these networks is never to do that at all, to take students that they may struggle, as at Ascend, the CMO that I ran in Brooklyn. We had students who struggled for years, who would have meltdowns twice a day, but we never gave up on them because we knew in the end they could and would succeed. And it was the most gratifying thing of everything that we did when we succeeded, and we did with those students. So I don't think it's pervasive in the way that you might be suggesting. Now, there are other related phenomena. In Boston, there is a significant exodus of students to the Boston public schools, particularly at the high school level. But the problem there is that the standards are higher in the charters, and some students see that they can go into BPS, have very little homework, very little expected of them, and they make that choice. That's a hard problem to solve. The correct response to that, in my view, is not a regulatory response by the charter oversight agency of the SEA, of the state education agency, that attempts to regulate the rates of suspension and so forth. Rather, and wailing on the charter school for it happening and saying, you have to do better, you can't lose your kids. Rather, the response should be to turn to the competing institution and saying, why are your standards so low, right? That would be a better response. So I don't remember all of your questions, but I think I hit on 2 of them. Other questions? Yes.
I had I guess, somewhat related question. I come from a learner-driven education, Montessori background, and also really believe in high expectations and academic achievement. But I wonder what you think about the idea that it seems like there's kind of this assumption that you need to have these high discipline environments in order to have high achievement and order and, growth. And I'm working with at least one district school in New York that has really high academic achievement with similar populations, but there's this idea, I mean, to your point about skills versus discipline, do you think that there's space to kind of shift? And this is somewhat unrelated to the anti-racist piece, but also related.
It's definitely related, but not exactly the same matter. Yeah, it's
Can
incredible.
you do self-directed learning and help kids develop executive functioning skills and hold them to a high standard, but approach it differently in terms of
Right.
instructions?
Well, I have 2 thoughts on that. First of all, absolutely it is. But the piece that I began with, the piece of paper on the floor and the broken pencil and so on, that has to be a characteristic of whatever cultural model is. And that's not abusive or disrespectful. It's the opposite of it, right? So the no excuses schools, yes, they had a very strong disciplinary model. It relied on what we called, I think it's a very evocative term, warm strict, that the teachers had to embody both great warmth and great strictness. And frankly, that was a very difficult thing to attain and not seen in nearly enough numbers. And many white teachers in particular were not able to do that. And this was a real problem. So I grant you that. Now, what happened at Ascend, my own network is the one that I know best, is that several years in, we took out conventional no excuses discipline. We didn't do away with very strong attention to procedures. Procedures are incredibly important. They sound really boring, but they matter immensely in making effective schools. How you enter the building, how you get into class, because time is precious. Now that in anti-racism would be considered unacceptable because urgency is considered a symptom of white supremacy culture, which I utterly reject. But the other dimensions of it, if you've been into some charters, you may have seen the clothes pins that are on. Everybody starts on green, and then if you have an infraction, you move. this is, I think, a rather oppressive system, and they are very effective alternatives to it. So we took out the traffic lights, or whatever they might be. They take different forms in different schools, and we put in place responsive classroom, which is a cultural system which is in use primarily in suburban schools, has been around for a very long time, and we had fabulous results with it. The schools became vastly more joyful. There was no decline in student behavior. But at the same time, I would also say that it's a fallacy to think that a school that exists in a environment of marginalization and disadvantage of every form is going to be able to do the very same thing as what happens in a upper middle class community. It's not the same situation. The middle class school can do very little and the kids will be okay, quite frankly. So to speak in technical terms, the effect that they have to have on kids is much less. In the urban schools serving the most marginalized kids, William Julius Wilson would have said this 20 years ago, you have a lot of maladaptations and dysfunction that is a result of violence and crime and poverty. And those things affect inevitably the students who come to school. And so your engagement with those students, it's not that it has to be harsher, but there's going to be more to do to create safety and security and goodwill and engagement in that setting, because there's going to be a tremendous amount of distrust to begin with that you have to work with.
So it sounds like you were in a conversation with Lisa, just sort of kind of conceding that there were some perversions of implementation from sort of the original no excuses ideology behind charters. I worked for Kim for 7 years.
Oh, great.
I think that some would argue that what we're seeing with the implementation of trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices is that same perversion, right? Like there's a purity in the ideology, and in the implementation, something else happens. And so I feel that the way we're orienting around that phenomenon is different when it comes to no excuses versus trauma-informed, culturally responsive or anti-racist practices. So I'm just sort of wondering if you could speak to how you differentiate those two things and ultimately come out on the side of like belief in sort of the core tenets of the no excuses ideology, but not in the core tenets of these other practices.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't believe that that it is useful in terms of educating kids and giving them opportunity to focus exclusively on trying to vanquish racism, because racism is pervasive in America and remains so, and it is an urgent cause to address it, but it's an enormous undertaking, and what we have to do now as educators is we have to teach the kids. And so what I think is getting lost is the teaching the kids part, and teaching the kids effectively. So we can't make the elimination of racism a precondition, I guess is what I would say, to educating students. And we can't make addressing trauma a precondition for educating or a substitute for education. I'm worried about the substitution of social justice education for an academic education. That's what I'm trying to say. That we have seen for decades that often teachers are more drawn to their therapeutic role than to their educational role. And that is very concerning, because what we really need them to be doing is to be thinking about, how do I write a really effective and deliver a really effective math lesson? so that reliably in the next 45 minutes, every student will have had a small taste of academic success, because it's those small little successes every day that transform a child's life. But if we are not ensuring, and it's really difficult to do, that that academic success occurs reliably every period, we're not doing right by our students. So there's a displacement of energy and focus away from a passion for great teaching to a passion for therapy. And I worry about that.
Michael, do we have any questions online in the chat?
There's one from Marty. Thanks for the compelling narrative. Is it possible to have a more optimistic interpretation that highlights the opportunity now for a constructive synthesis between No Excuses 1.0 and the critique? As you have acknowledged, there were troubling aspects of how the No Excuses model was often implemented in practice. While the model generated impressive results relative to local alternatives, are we confident that it is the best or only way to prepare students for long-term success?
Well, first of all, Marty, I'm delighted for the question and wish that you were here in person. And it's nice to hear from you. I don't really think so, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to. I think that a liberal education, if I can pivot away from the term anti-racism, which I'm very worried about, will not be remembered as capital A, capital R. But if we contrast a liberal education with a social justice education, I do think that they're fundamentally irreconcilable. So in No Excuses, as it evolved, at least in principle, towards the ideal of a liberal education, we said that we have all the tools now. We can act now with urgency, and we can make it happen. Social justice education says, on the contrary, until we have addressed and vanquished racism, we can't make progress. That's one different message. The message about opportunity is totally different. In No Excuses and in a liberal education, the message is profoundly optimistic, that if you work hard, if you apply yourself, you have opportunity in America today. And the message of anti-racism is, no, you don't have opportunity. You exist in a zero-sum society of the oppressors and the oppressed. And racism is eternal, and all we can do is continue to pay penance for it. That's a very different message. And by the way, perhaps among the most worried about that dimension, the message of pessimism. Success in life, and by however you want to define success, is impossible in the absence of optimism. So we have to impart a fundamentally optimistic message while being realistic about the external conditions. The notion of excuse making is very different. In No Excuses, we say that we don't make excuses. In social justice education, we say that we have one inexhaustible excuse for not doing right by our kids, which is racism. So I think that they're also very different when it comes to the idea of cultivating fortitude and resilience. We don't conceive in a liberal education of children as being fundamentally fragile. We conceive of them as being strong, and we cultivate their fortitude and resilience, not remind them of their weakness, and creating a culture that venerates weakness, as is happening on campus. So those are very different philosophies. We embrace testing, because if we're not measuring how we're doing, we have no way of knowing if we're running good schools or bad schools. In anti-racist education, testing is considered to be oppressive and a tool of white supremacy culture. Tests are deemed to be inherently biased and measuring only one form of knowledge, which is white knowledge. So I don't see how you take these very different conceptions and say we're just going to kind of finesse that they can be reconciled. I don't think that's the case.
Can I just really quick follow-up to Sophia's question? The idea, you said that trauma shouldn't, like addressing trauma shouldn't be a precondition for education. I'm curious as to, with all the research that has come out about the effect of trauma on the brain, addressing trauma is a precondition for learning and for students being able to access learning. So while I do not believe it is entirely the role of the school to provide therapeutic services nonstop for all the student, for all the children alone, like there also needs to be education. How does that idea play into what you're proposing?
Well, I think that you have to create a, like any institution is driven, any great institution is driven by a great culture, right? So schools, charter schools and district schools have to create distinctive cultures of their own. They have to be driven by a clear set of values and a theory of action. And clearly in urban schools, those schools have to be overwhelmingly joyful, welcoming, safe, and they have to provide, children have to feel secure, they have to feel loved, most of all, they have to feel known as individuals, not as members of an identity group, but as individuals with their own passions, their own curiosities, their own ambitions, not as representatives of a particular class. And that's what we have to do. And if we create that kind of setting where students feel known and heard, where they feel that they have agency, where they feel that they can exert their voice and be heard in the world, where their ideas matter, then we create a place where students, despite having suffered the trauma, the events in their own lives that you're describing, can begin to thrive. And thrive they will in that setting. So if what I've described to you means addressing trauma, then I'm all for it. But I'm not for substituting academic education with a program of therapy.
I think there's another question online.
Yes.
Is your hand up? Yeah.
So this is from Paul Peterson. He commends you for the powerful message. I have a question about timeline. My data on student performance at charters shows steady improvement nationwide and especially among African Americans until 2017. Are you talking about post-COVID? If so, can you be sure recent trends are not due to school closures rather than the academic trends you identify? Have those academic trends really filtered down into charter schools at scale or just in certain places?
Well, so first of all, Paul, wonderful to have you. Wish you were here as well. Greetings from across a very long time. So yeah, so this is a great question. The data that I think where most of us are thinking about are the Credo study. Guess what? The last year of the Credo study, it was 2015 to 2019. So 2019 is just when the charter schools were still operating on all cylinders, getting the kind of results that I was describing. It was just before 2020. Of course, this is the first year of the pandemic. Schools closed in mid-March, I think, of 2020. Testing was suspended in 2020. I think if Mackie Raymond had done her study using 2022-23 data, which is when testing resumed, we would not have seen the incredibly striking results that we saw. So why this delay factor? Well, it's just the fact that there is an absorption of these new ideas into their institutions. These institutions, the networks I've been describing, have very robust academic systems that have been developed over years. It takes time for them to erode. And by the way, they erode very differently in some organizations than in others, which is a point I would love to just make very briefly, if you'll bear with me. In certain institutions, like Success Academy, where you have a absolutely formidable, I'm going to try to use the right words, woman, Eva Moskovich at the helm, who is absolutely unstoppable, unbreakable, a force of nature. She didn't succumb to any of these ideas. She just kept plowing on ahead. You don't like it? Too bad. When I incurred my little contretemps at Ascend, she invited me to have a drink, and she said, Stephen, this would never have happened to me because I would just fire the trustee. That's the way she thinks about the world. I hope she wouldn't mind my sharing that story. And then you have others. I mean, look at the Brook Charter Schools in Boston, the strongest results of all the Boston charters, run by a formidable leader whose name I will forget.
Ms. Murray, and John, John.
Yeah, so the
Yes.
absolutely formidable. She went, since we're in this institution, we can say this, Harvard undergraduate, Harvard Law School, Harvard Graduate School of Education. You don't fool around with her. You just don't. She knows what she stands for. She knows what she's trying to do. So where schools were led by formidable leaders, and by the way, where they were led by Black leaders, they often did not decline because those leaders were committed to the system, didn't feel any need to signal anything one way or another. They knew that these methods helped their kids, and they went right on going. So those institutions and schools survived. So there's a very big difference. Some networks have continued to perform. Others we're going to see really shocking differences. So then the effect of the pandemic. Well, yes, I mean, the pandemic hurt everybody dramatically. Everybody's results fell across both traditional public schools and the charter sector. But if you look at the decline of major networks where their schools, which were once beating the state average and reversing by both achievement gaps by race and achievement gaps even by income, and are now performing below their city schools, you can see that both of those types of institutions were affected by the pandemic, by closures, by high rates of absent students, and yet one was more deeply affected than the other. So that suggests that the pandemic is not the cause.
And by the way, I think you're probably thinking of Kimberly.
Yeah.
Kimberly, thank you. That's the name I was
Yeah,
thinking of.
yeah.
I don't know her.
That's right.
That's why, sorry, I don't remember. Yeah.
So just one sort of follow-up, I mean, just to Paul's point, it'll be difficult to tease apart sort
Yeah,
of
of
what
course.
was the pandemic and what were these other effects. So it may be a few more years of research.
Yeah, and
before
you're
we-
absolutely, thank you,
able to-
Jim, for
able to
that
get there.
caution.
Yeah. And you had a question?
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for this. I know we're on the record, so I just want to say, like, I'm not a charter school hater. This question is going to come across as maybe a little provocative.
Great.
So the narrative arc I heard in your telling of the charter history is that charters were once really great. And then the big bad antagonist, woke monster, came in and watered down the rigor. And I guess I have an alternative arc of history, and I want to get your perspective on this. In 2008, I worked for a KIPP school in DC, and we were disciplining students, all of whom were Black, by putting them in white t-shirts and making them sit in the corner of the room silent for days on end. We used to regularly turn away students with multiple disabilities. The admin would dock our pay if we were like 5 minutes late to work, make us grind out 60 to 70-hour weeks for very mediocre pay. So I guess, like, I'm wondering if the current struggle of charters, if that really is a thing, is maybe the idea that those practices were the practices that I do think we gloss over a little bit, that they were truly awful, and that, like, the increased scrutiny from journalism, from academics, sort of shined a light on that, and charters actually struggled to innovate, like kind of what Shanker originally wanted them to do, and instead of sort of succumb to just like organizational isomorphism. And meanwhile, public schools, which, like, I worked for 3 charter schools, then left to lead a public school, have actually like used that competition threat of charter schools, learned from some of their good practices, and then actually done some innovative work while still sort of being more inclusive in terms of labor practices, discipline, and just overall education. So, like, your perspective on that.
Well, we do have to be careful about large generalizations, which I'm extremely guilty of. But I hear a little bit of generalization in your question as well. So I'm I'm sorry and horrified to hear that that was your experience in that particular KIPP school. And the early KIPP practice of the porch, as it was known, were students who,
Bench.
the bench, so, well, it was the porch originally, but yes, whatever we want to call it, where students were excluded from the classroom and then invited to join back. Look, no one's going to defend that. Although, by the way, that practice came from Harriet Ball, which was one of Dave and one of their original mentors, who was herself Black. So I mean, these things get complicated, but those practices are indefensible. And I would submit that there's been a great deal of learning that has happened in the sector, and most schools have moved away from those egregious practices. I mean, certainly at Ascend, we never did anything like that, that's for sure. But we moved away from many dimensions, like as I said, the stoplight or whatever you want to call it, kind of disciplinary practices, to something entirely different. And I would say if you went to look at most KIPP schools or Uncommon or Achievement First, you would not see what you're describing. But as I'm delighted, by the way, with the second half of what you said, which is that that you're seeing the effects of competition, which is that the district sector is responding in your assessment, at least anecdotally, to these innovations or to these practices and trying to do better. That's exactly what we all hope for, is that we would induce this press for improvement where everyone would try to get better. And if charters do that, and if they do it in a provocative way, and if people bring criticisms about their practices, this is fabulous.
Ask you, and this may both be connected to kind of how to move from where we are to, a better place. But also maybe just in terms of the status quo, if you will, one of the missing voices. I'm wondering to what extent parents are a relevant stakeholder here. Not obviously they're relevant in that their children are there, but in terms of their engagement with some of these questions. Because certainly there are schools, Brooke might be a great example of it, where there's tremendous parent support and satisfaction and excess demand for more, for more seats and more opportunity for their children. But I think in my perception is that parents are mostly not heard in this conversation, and obviously there are issues that they're concerned about in terms of school safety and in terms of just proximity to their homes and just their overall sense of the extent to which their children are happy at school. But to what extent can parents or should parents be involved in this conversation about what the sort of academic part of school should look like?
Well, of course they should be, and I think they are. But I will just mention that their power is the most fundamental power of all, which is that they can vote with their feet and leave the school and go to a better one. And that has a very bracing effect on the operators of these schools, the principals, the networks, because they are paid on the basis of each individual student. If they don't continue to earn and re-earn the confidence of every parent in their building, the school will tank and close, and not through any regulatory discretion, but because they won't have any money to keep the doors open. I think that's the ultimate form of accountability.
And do you see any of that happening as a result of some of these shifts? Or
Oh, absolutely. I mean, well, as a result of these particular shifts. Well, I will say that I was speaking to a journalist. I can't say this was my own conversation, but an education journalist who said that he was talking to the CEO of a large network in New York City, who said, no parent has ever come to me and said, I want you to be doing more anti-racist education in my school. Not once. What they've come and said is, I want my child to be educated. I want more rigorous teaching. I want my child to be further ahead. I want my child to be able to get into a good four-year college. I mean, parents know that to succeed in life, you have to be able to do something, offer something that society values. And if you are not equipped with that competence and that skill, it is disrespectful and a assault on your dignity to say that you'll be okay, because you won't be. And parents know that. So parents' fundamental concern is to ensure that learning can happen and students can get ahead and can thrive and have the same opportunities that students from middle class and the privileged have. And that's what these schools are in fact doing. If we look in New Jersey, the charter sector is outperforming the state average, is reversing achievement gaps, not just anecdotally in individual schools, but across the board. And we should be desperately curious about what they're doing and try to have a lot more of them. And you can be sure that what they're doing is they're focused on instruction. How do we make every period of the day as effective as possible? They're focused on the 101% solutions that drive great outcomes for kids.
So maybe on that note, I think we're almost done. I think unless you've got any closing remarks, I
No,
think
I
we'll
talked
end
way
it
too
there.
much. Thank you for your.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. See you next week.